The string quartet is perhaps the purest of the classical forms. In a way, there's nowhere to hide. You have four very clear, independent strands. The piano, you can put the pedal down, play big chords, create a racket, not with a string quartet. But what I wanted to do with this string quartet, as well as that clarity, is to create rich colors, rich harmonies, because that's the sort of thing I like. I'm a big fan of chocolate cake and fruit cake, and that sometimes goes into my musical tastes too. And I think in terms of string quartets very often, actually, when I'm playing, particularly, let's say, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. Many of those piano sonatas, you could play them instantly as a string quartet. They're four parts. Even something like the opening of Opus 111 of Beethoven, it's a string quartet. And I think sometimes if you think in terms of that, and you think in terms of bowing, how would I bow this? Would I begin on an up bow or a down bow? I talk about this a lot with students, because I think that's one way, as well as thinking about singing, of course, but it's one way actually of creating a way of shaping a phrase, of pacing, if you think in terms of the bow. I guess it's about 3.5 years ago now, but Ed, the first violinist of the quartet, was in Santa Barbara, where I was also there at the Music Academy of the West. And they did a whole concert of my songs, and Ed heard them, and I think he must have liked them, because he then got in touch and said, would I think of writing a quartet for the group? And I was thrilled, and it was particularly a project that came about as an album, recording Ravel and Dutilleux quartets, and then they wanted a piece to go with them. That's quite daunting, because those two quartets are two of the greatest works of the 20th century. And so I had to fit alongside them, or in the middle of them. And actually in the middle is exactly what I thought of. What was happening in the 70 years between the writing of those two quartets? Well, the whole 20th century, really. 2 world wars, revolutions all over the place. Everything that makes modern life what it is, from electricity to women's votes to everything. I mean, the world completely changed after the First World War. And although this piece only has a very indirect influence from that, that was how I started thinking about this. I was thinking about France, Paris, in that period. And you have these composers, les six, most famously Poulenc. And so I took the scent of Poulenc, the flavor of Poulenc, and started to work from there in creating this piece, because actually Ravel and Dutilleux aren't in any way part of that group. Their aesthetic is very different from that. They're much more fastidious, much more, I'm not going to say detached, but refined, whereas with Poulenc, you know, it's a glass of wine in a cafe in Montmartre. It's that kind of feeling of the Paris that we all know and love in that interwar period of Coco Chanel and indeed of Stravinsky and of Picasso and so on. So those were the shadows that I invited to join me in the creation of this piece. But I don't quote any of those composers, it's just a mood and a flavor. It's a joy to work with this amazing group, and we've worked together before. We've actually recorded the Brahms Quintet a number of years ago, and we've played the Dvorak also before. But I'd never worked with them on the other side as a composer. And I have to say, and I'm not just saying this because they might see this video and therefore I need to be nice to them, but I've never worked with anyone who has been so conscientious way in advance of the premiere what did I want here? Is this what I meant? You know, what about this? I mean, they worked so hard on this piece, and that any composer, you know, is thrilled by that, because you hope that you write a piece of a certain subtlety, and there are things that can't be sight-read. And so much music, contemporary music indeed of the full 20th century, has suffered, I think, because performers have never learned it properly. And so in the first performance, you're not really hearing the piece. It's happened so many times, and I've heard orchestral performances of works, and I've thought, you know, I think behind that rather out-of-tune, muddy texture, there's probably a wonderful piece to be heard someday. And of course, it's very often only a first performance that a piece gets, and then it gets put on the shelf, and that's a great tragedy. So I feel incredibly privileged to have worked with a group of the highest professional dedication. And indeed, I heard it in the flesh for the first time just 2 nights ago in where were we? Berkeley. And they were being very creative with it and making it into a real theatre piece, a real audience stage piece, and that was very exciting for me. So yeah, 100% happy about how they're working with it.